Please, the woman whispered through trembling lips, her voice barely louder than the rain tapping against the old garage windows. If anyone asks, tell them you never saw me. Some acts of kindness arrive without warning, asking for nothing except courage. And sometimes, the greatest miracle begins the moment an ordinary person chooses compassion over suspicion. On the northern edge of Ashford, Montana, where pine trees stretch toward endless gray skies and neighbors still wave from pickup trucks, Ethan Carter had long accepted that life wasn't interested in giving him easy days. At 39, he worked 12-hour shifts repairing engines in the small garage attached to his weathered farmhouse, raised his 8-year-old daughter Lily alone, and carried the quiet ache of losing his wife 5 years earlier like an old scar that no longer bled but never truly healed. Every evening followed nearly the same rhythm. The scent of motor oil lingered in the air. Coffee cooled untouched on his workbench. Country radio hummed softly beneath the steady drumming of rain against the tin roof. It wasn't exciting, but it was honest, and Ethan had learned that honest lives rarely made headlines. They simply kept moving forward one sunrise at a time. That October evening, the storm arrived faster than anyone expected. Dark clouds swallowed the last trace of daylight before 6 o'clock, and cold rain swept across the valley with enough force to blur the highway beyond his gravel driveway. Lily looked up from the kitchen table where she was finishing her homework. "Daddy," she called, "did you hear that?" Ethan paused, wrench still in his hand. At first he heard only thunder rolling across distant hills. Then came another sound. 3 slow knocks against the front porch door. Knock, knock, knock. Not hurried, not desperate, just strangely gentle. Ethan frowned. Few people visited during storms, especially this far outside town. Wiping his grease-stained hands on an old towel, he crossed the wooden floor and opened the door. Standing beneath the porch light was a woman completely soaked by the rain. Her dark wool coat clung to her shoulders. Damp strands of blonde hair framed a pale face that looked exhausted rather than frightened. She carried no suitcase, no purse, no phone, only silence. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Water dripped from the porch roof between them. Wind carried the scent of wet pine through the doorway. Ethan noticed how tightly she wrapped her arms around herself, not from fear alone, but from the biting cold settling into the valley. "Ma'am," he said gently, "are you hurt?" She slowly shook her head. "Just tired." Her voice sounded refined, almost practiced, yet strangely fragile, as though she hadn't spoken in hours. Lily quietly appeared beside her father, peeking around his arm with the innocent curiosity only a child could possess. The little girl studied the stranger for a heartbeat before disappearing into the hallway without saying a word. Moments later, she returned carrying her favorite knitted blanket. Without hesitation, she held it toward the woman. "You look cold," Lily said softly. The stranger stared at the small blanket, as if no one had offered her kindness in a very long time. Her eyes shimmered, though no tears fell. Ethan stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come inside," he said. "We'll figure everything else out tomorrow." Neither of them noticed the black SUV slowing almost invisibly on the rain-soaked road beyond the trees before quietly disappearing into the darkness. The warmth inside the little farmhouse returned slowly, not because the old furnace suddenly worked any better, but because kindness always seemed to make small rooms feel larger. The stranger sat quietly at the worn oak kitchen table with Lily's knitted blanket wrapped around her shoulders, while steam curled gently from a mug of hot chicken soup Ethan had warmed on the stove. She held the bowl carefully between both hands, almost as though she had forgotten what it felt like to be offered something without expectation. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows, and somewhere beyond the walls the wind whispered through towering pine trees that had guarded the Carter property for generations. Ethan never believed in asking difficult questions before someone was ready to answer them. Years earlier, after losing his wife, strangers had often asked him how it happened before they even learned her name. He never forgot how heavy those questions felt. So instead he simply smiled and said, "You are safe here tonight." The woman looked up with quiet surprise. "You are not going to ask who I am?" she asked. Ethan shook his head slowly. "Everyone has a story. Sometimes people need a little warmth before they can tell it." For the first time since arriving, the corners of her lips lifted into a faint smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Lily climbed onto the chair across from her and rested her elbows on the table. "My name is Lily," she announced proudly. "Daddy fixes cars, and I make sure he remembers to eat dinner." Ethan laughed softly. "She is telling the truth." The stranger let out a quiet laugh of her own, small but genuine enough to brighten the room. "That sounds like a very important job." Lily nodded seriously. "It is." The conversation drifted naturally after that. They spoke about the weather, the old farmhouse, and the maple tree outside that turned brilliant shades of orange every fall. Ethan noticed the woman answered politely but carefully, avoiding anything about where she had come from or where she planned to go next. Whenever a question wandered too close to her past, her eyes instinctively moved toward the rain-covered window. She was carrying something much heavier than the soaked coat hanging beside the front door. After dinner, Ethan showed her the small guest room that had once belonged to his late father. The furniture was simple, the quilt handmade, and the wooden dresser carried decades of scratches that no one had bothered to hide. "It is not fancy," Ethan admitted, "but everything here works." She slowly ran her fingers across the old quilt stitched with faded blue stars. "It is more than enough," she whispered. As Ethan prepared to leave, she quietly asked, "Why are you helping me?" He paused with one hand on the doorframe before answering. "Because someday my daughter might need someone to help her without asking for proof that she deserves it." Silence settled gently between them. It was the kind of silence that carried respect instead of discomfort. After the bedroom door closed, the woman remained standing for several moments, listening to the peaceful sounds of the house. Lily giggled somewhere down the hallway. Ethan washed dishes while humming an old country song under his breath. The floor creaked softly with every familiar step. It had been years since she had spent a night anywhere that felt like a home instead of destination. Outside, nearly half a mile away, another black sport utility vehicle eased onto the shoulder beneath the shelter of towering evergreens. Its headlights remained off as two distant figures quietly watched the warm glow shining from the Carter farmhouse, waiting patiently for the moment everything would change. Morning arrived quietly over Ashford, washing the valley in pale autumn sunlight that shimmered across rain-soaked fields and drifting patches of fog. The storm had disappeared during the night, leaving only fresh air scented with wet pine, damp earth, and with smoke rising from scattered farmhouses. Ethan was already outside before 7 o'clock, lifting the garage door as its old metal tracks groaned in familiar protest. He had always believed that honest work was the simplest way to keep painful memories from growing too loud. Inside the farmhouse, Lily found the guest room door slightly open. She peeked inside and smiled when she saw the woman carefully folding the handmade quilt instead of leaving it on the bed. "Daddy says guests never have to make their bed," Lily said. The woman looked back with a gentle smile. "My mother used to tell me that every borrowed kindness should be returned in whatever way we can." Lily considered those words seriously before replying, "I like your mother already." The woman's smile lingered for a moment before soft sadness crossed her face. "So did I." A few minutes later, the three of them shared breakfast around the small kitchen table. Fresh scrambled eggs, buttered toast, homemade strawberry jam, and coffee filled the room with comforting aromas that seemed to soften the silence between strangers. Ethan noticed she held her coffee cup with both hands as though savoring not only the warmth but the peace surrounding it. "Noringing phones interruptive breakfast." No assistants hurried into the room. No schedule demanded every minute of the morning. It was simply three people sharing a meal beneath soft sunlight pouring through old windows. "You still have not told us your name," Lily said with innocent curiosity. The woman hesitated only briefly. "Claire," she answered at last. Ethan nodded politely. "It is nice to meet you properly, Claire." She lowered her eyes for a moment. It was not the full truth, but neither was it entirely a lie. After breakfast, Ethan prepared to leave for the garage. Claire quietly stood beside the kitchen sink before asking, May I help with something while I am here? Ethan smiled. You do not owe us anything. Perhaps not, Claire answered softly, but I would still like to help. Lily immediately clapped her hands. Daddy needs help organizing receipts. Ethan laughed. That is because I'm better at fixing engines than paperwork. Claire followed him into the garage where sunlight reflected off polished wrenches and rows of neatly arranged tools. She studied the shelves with surprising attention before noticing several invoices stacked beside an aging cash register. You keep everything by hand? She asked. Ethan shrugged. Computers are expensive. Pencil still works. Claire quietly sorted through several folders without saying another word. Within minutes, she had arranged unpaid invoices, warranty forms, supplier receipts, and customer records in separate piles so efficiently that even Ethan paused in surprise. You have done this before, he observed. Claire gently smiled without looking up. Something similar. Before he could ask another question, an elderly rancher drove into the gravel lot with an old pickup truck that refused to start. Ethan walked outside to greet his customer while Claire remained inside the garage office. Through the dusty window, she watched him patiently explain the repair instead of selling unnecessary work. He treated every customer with the same calm respect, whether they carried a worn wallet or drove a brand new truck. It was a kind of leadership she had not witnessed in years. As the morning passed, Claire glanced toward the highway and froze. Far beyond the fields, two identical black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly past the entrance before continuing toward town. They never stopped, but she recognized them immediately. They belonged to people who knew exactly where to look, and for the first time since arriving, she realized the quiet sanctuary she had found might not remain hidden much longer. By late afternoon, the little garage had settled into its familiar rhythm. The steady clink of wrenches echoed beneath the open rafters. Engines rumbled, then quieted. The faint scent of fresh coffee drifted from the office where Claire sat surrounded by neatly organized folders that had once looked impossible to untangle. Ethan glanced toward the desk every now and then, still amazed by how effortlessly she transformed weeks of paperwork into perfect order. I think you saved me at least 3 Saturdays, he joked as he wiped his hands on a clean shop towel. Claire looked up with a gentle smile. Sometimes the biggest problems only need someone willing to slow down and look carefully. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like something experience teaches. She hesitated before answering. Sometimes experience teaches us after it takes everything else first. Neither of them said another word. The silence carried understanding rather than curiosity. Lily arrived after school, just before 4 o'clock, dropping her backpack beside the office door before running straight toward Ethan. Mrs. Jenkins gave me an A on my history project, she announced proudly. Ethan smiled and pulled her into a hug. I knew you could do it. Lily immediately turned toward Claire. Can I show you? Claire's eyes brightened with genuine warmth. I would love that. For nearly half an hour, the two of them sat together at the old wooden table, looking through hand-drawn maps and handwritten notes about Lewis and Clark. Claire listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions that made Lily beam with confidence. Ethan watched quietly from beneath the raised hood of a customer's truck. It had been years since he had seen someone invest so much. Patience in his daughter after knowing her for only 2 days. Something about the scene stirred a feeling he had almost forgotten. Not hope exactly, but the possibility that broken hearts could still recognize home. As the evening sun settled lower behind the mountains, the last customer waved goodbye from the driveway. Ethan locked the cash drawer, while Claire gathered the remaining paperwork into carefully labeled folders. Everything should be easier now, she said softly. Ethan looked over the shelves in disbelief. Every receipt had been filed, every invoice balanced, every supplier account listed by date. You keep saying you have done something similar, he replied with a smile. I'm beginning to think you are being modest. Claire lowered her eyes. Maybe I am simply better with numbers than engines. Lily laughed from the doorway. Daddy is better with pancakes than numbers too. They all laughed together, and for a brief moment the weight each of them carried seemed lighter. That evening they ate homemade vegetable soup while orange sunlight poured across the kitchen floor. Lily talked excitedly about the upcoming fall festival. Ethan listened with quiet amusement, and Claire found herself smiling more than she had in months. She realized something that unsettled her far more than the black vehicle she had noticed earlier. She did not want this ordinary evening to end. No board meeting had ever given her this kind of peace. No luxury penthouse had ever sounded as comforting as the gentle creak of this old farmhouse settling after sunset. Later, after Lily had gone upstairs to finish reading before bed, Ethan stepped onto the front porch with 2 mugs of warm cider. He handed one to Claire without speaking. Together they watched the fading light disappear behind rows of golden aspens while crickets filled the cooling air with quiet music. "Thank you," Claire said almost in a whisper, "for trusting someone you do not know." Ethan rested his elbows on the porch railing. Trust always starts before certainty does. Claire looked toward him, her expression softening with emotion she had buried for years. Before she could answer, distant headlights appeared again beyond the trees. This time, they did not continue past the property. 2 black sport utility vehicles slowed near the entrance to the long gravel driveway, remained motionless for several silent seconds, and then quietly turned around as though someone inside had confirmed exactly what they had been searching for. The next morning began with a sky so clear it seemed impossible that a storm had passed through only days before. Sunlight spilled across the Carter property, warming the faded red siding of the farmhouse and casting long golden beams through the open garage door. The peaceful rhythm returned once again. A socket wrench clicked steadily against steel. The smell of fresh-cut cedar drifted from a neighboring ranch. Somewhere across the valley, a church bell quietly marked 9 o'clock. Ethan believed that ordinary mornings were life's greatest blessings because they often arrived unnoticed. Claire stood near the office window with a notebook balanced in her hands, reviewing the records she had organized the previous afternoon. She had made several careful suggestions, not changing Ethan's business, only helping him see opportunities he had overlooked. "You have customers who come back every year," she said thoughtfully. "They trust you. That is worth more than advertising." Ethan smiled while tightening the final bolt beneath an old pickup truck. "People around here remember who treats them fairly." Claire nodded almost to herself. "That is becoming rare." Before either of them could continue, the familiar sound of tires rolling across gravel interrupted the quiet morning. Ethan looked up expecting another customer, but instead a black sport utility vehicle slowly passed the front entrance without turning in. Its windows were dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. A minute later, a second identical vehicle followed the same path at the same slow speed before disappearing down the county road. Claire instinctively stopped breathing for a heartbeat. She lowered her eyes before Ethan noticed the sudden change in her expression. "Friend of yours?" he asked casually. She answered a little too quickly. "I do not think so." Ethan studied her face for only a moment before returning to his work. He had learned long ago that trust meant allowing people to reveal their truth in their own time. Still, something about those vehicles lingered in his thoughts. They were too expensive for this quiet farming community and far too interested in driving past the same property. By lunchtime, Lily arrived, carrying sandwiches she and a neighbor had prepared together. She skipped across the gravel lot with the easy joy only children seemed able to protect. "I brought extra cookies," she announced proudly. Claire laughed as Lily carefully divided everything into 3 equal portions. "Daddy says sharing makes food taste better." Ethan smiled. "I do say that." They ate outside beneath the shade of an old maple tree whose leaves had begun turning shades of crimson and gold. A gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the yard while birds called from nearby fence posts. For a little while, the outside world felt wonderfully far away. Then Claire noticed something that made her quietly straighten in her chair. Across the highway, nearly a quarter-mile away, one of the black vehicles had stopped beside an empty field. No one stepped out. It simply remained there, almost blending into the landscape. Ethan followed her gaze. "They have been around a lot lately," he observed. Claire forced a calm smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Perhaps they are looking for someone." Ethan looked at her gently. "Maybe they are. The conversation drifted elsewhere, but neither of them truly forgot what they had seen. Later that afternoon, Claire offered to help clean the garage while Ethan finished replacing a transmission. As she swept the concrete floor, her attention fell on a framed family photograph resting above the workbench. Ethan stood beside his late wife, both smiling as they held a baby Lily beneath bright summer sunshine. Claire stared at the picture longer than she intended. She had kind eyes, Claire said quietly. Ethan looked toward the photograph with peaceful sadness. She believed every person deserved another chance. Claire whispered, almost to herself, she chose well. At that very moment, many miles away, inside a towering glass office building overlooking downtown Chicago, a silent conference room displayed one photograph on every screen. It was Claire's face. Around the table, anxious executives waited as a senior advisor finally spoke the words everyone had feared. We have confirmed she is alive. We also know exactly where she has been hiding. The following morning arrived with a strange stillness that even the birds seemed to notice. A blanket of silver mist floated above the open fields surrounding the Carter farmhouse, softening every fence line and pine tree beneath the pale October sun. Ethan had already rolled open the garage door when Lily hurried outside, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate, one for herself and one for Claire. Daddy says every cold morning deserves something warm, she said with a grin. Claire accepted the mug with both hands and smiled in a way that felt more natural than it had only a few days earlier. Your father is wiser than he realizes. Ethan chuckled while checking the oil beneath an aging family sedan. I just know cold fingers do not fix engines very well. The peaceful routine lasted less than an hour. Shortly before 10 o'clock, 3 black sport utility vehicles turned slowly onto the long gravel driveway, their polished paint reflecting the morning sunlight. They moved carefully, without flashing lights or raised voices, before stopping several yards from the garage. The engines fell silent. For a long moment, no one stepped outside. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Ethan instinctively looked toward Claire. She had gone completely still. Her fingers tightened around the warm mug as she quietly closed her eyes for a single breath. They found me, she whispered so softly that only Ethan heard her. The front passenger door opened, and a distinguished man in his 60s stepped onto the gravel wearing a dark overcoat despite the mild weather. 2 women in professional business attire followed, carrying leather folders instead of briefcases. Behind them stood several security professionals who remained respectfully near the vehicles, giving the impression of protection rather than intimidation. The older gentleman removed his glasses before speaking. Miss Whitmore, he said with visible relief. We have been searching for you everywhere. Ethan frowned slightly. The name meant nothing to him. Claire slowly placed the untouched mug on the workbench before taking a steady breath. Good morning, Daniel. His expression softened immediately. The board has been waiting for your decision. Thousands of employees have been asking when you would return. Every major news network has reported your disappearance. Ethan looked from Daniel to Claire, confused by the conversation unfolding in front of him. Lily quietly walked closer to her father and slipped her small hand into his. Claire turned toward Ethan, and for the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, she no longer looked like someone hiding. She looked like someone carrying an enormous responsibility she had hoped to escape, even if only for a few precious days. My full name is Claire Whitmore, she said gently. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Global Industries. Silence settled over the garage. Ethan blinked once, believing he must have misunderstood. The simple woman who had folded blankets, organized receipts, washed dishes, and laughed over homemade soup was standing before him as the leader of one of the largest companies in the country. Lily looked up at Claire with innocent confusion. Does that mean you have a really big office? Claire smiled through glistening eyes. Yes, sweetheart, a very big office. Lily nodded thoughtfully. I like our kitchen better. Daniel lowered his head, unable to hide a small smile. Ethan remained quiet, not because he was impressed by wealth, but because he suddenly understood why she had guarded her story so carefully. Claire stepped closer to him. "I did not lie because I wanted to deceive you," she said softly. "I stayed silent because I wanted to know whether anyone could see me before they saw my title." Ethan looked at her for several long seconds before offering the same calm smile he had shown on the rainy night she arrived. "Claire," he answered gently, "I never needed your title to know exactly who you were." The convoy departed as quietly as it had arrived, leaving only faint tire tracks across the gravel driveway and an unfamiliar silence hanging over the Carter farmhouse. Claire stood beside the final vehicle for several long moments before looking back one last time. The old garage door remained open. Ethan had already returned to tightening a loose belt beneath a customer's truck, not because he wished to ignore what had happened, but because he understood that some goodbyes became harder when they lasted too long. Lily could not hide her disappointment. She ran toward Claire and wrapped her small arms around her waist. "Will you come back?" she asked with the honesty only children possessed. Claire knelt until they were eye level. She gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from Lily's face before answering. "I hope so more than you know." Lily reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out the little knitted blanket she had shared on that rainy night. "You should keep this," she said, "until you visit again." Claire accepted the folded blanket as though it were the most valuable gift she had ever received. Her voice nearly disappeared. "Thank you." She looked toward Ethan. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Finally, she smiled with quiet gratitude. "You reminded me what home feels like." Ethan nodded gently. "Then do not forget it." As the vehicles disappeared beyond the winding county road, the farmhouse seemed strangely larger and emptier at the same time. Life quickly returned to its familiar routine, yet every familiar sound carried the memory of someone who had unexpectedly become part of it. The kitchen table once again held only 2 coffee mugs each morning. The guest room remained perfectly clean, but Ethan never closed its door completely. Lily still set 3 plates on the dinner table by habit before quietly putting one away with a thoughtful smile. Days passed, then another week. Autumn settled deeper across Montana as golden leaves drifted through the fields like quiet reminders that every season eventually changes. Ethan buried himself in work, grateful that the paperwork Claire had organized continued, making the business run more smoothly than ever. Before, customers noticed invoices arrived on time. Parts were ordered more efficiently. For the first time in years, Ethan ended a week without worrying whether he could cover every expense. He smiled each time he opened the neatly labeled filing cabinet she had left behind. It felt like receiving encouragement from someone no longer there. Hundreds of miles away, Claire returned to a completely different world. Glass towers reflected endless skylines. Elevators carried executives between polished boardrooms. Schedules filled every hour of every day. Advisors surrounded her with financial reports, acquisition proposals, investor briefings, and interviews waiting to be rescheduled. Everyone seemed relieved that their chief executive officer had finally returned. Yet something had quietly changed. During meetings, Claire occasionally found herself staring through floor-to-ceiling windows instead of presentation screens. The polished conference tables looked colder than she remembered. Catered lunches tasted less satisfying than Ethan's homemade vegetable soup. Expensive silence inside luxury offices felt strangely empty compared to the peaceful creak of an old farmhouse settling after sunset. One afternoon, Daniel entered her office carrying several reports requiring immediate approval. He noticed she was not looking at the documents spread across her desk. Instead, she was holding a small folded knitted blanket with faded blue stitching. "The board is pleased you are back," Daniel said carefully. Claire smiled without lifting her eyes. "I came back because I had responsibilities." She gently folded the blanket again. "But my heart is still somewhere in Montana." Daniel followed her gaze toward the distant skyline before quietly asking, "Do you intend to return?" Claire looked out beyond the city as afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass buildings. A peaceful smile slowly appeared on her face. "Not because I have to," she answered softly. Because there is someone who never cared who I was, and that is becoming harder to forget with every passing day. Nearly 3 weeks passed before the quiet rhythm of the Carter family was interrupted again. Frost now covered the fields each morning, sparkling beneath the first rays of sunlight like scattered crystal across the Montana countryside. Ethan had just finished replacing the brakes on an old ranch truck when a customer hurried into the garage, holding a newspaper beneath his arm. "You made the front page without even knowing it," the man said with a smile. Ethan accepted the paper with puzzled curiosity. Across the business section appeared a large photograph of Claire standing behind a podium inside a bright conference hall in Chicago. The headline spoke about Whitmore Global Industries, announcing a nationwide initiative dedicated to supporting small family-owned businesses in rural communities. Ethan read the article quietly until one sentence caught his attention. The program would recognize honesty, local service, and businesses that strengthen their communities through integrity rather than size. No one else noticed the small smile that appeared on his face. He folded the newspaper and returned to work without another word. Hundreds of miles away, reporters filled a grand ballroom where cameras flashed beneath elegant chandeliers. Investors expected Claire to introduce another ambitious expansion strategy. Instead, she stood calmly behind the microphone and looked across the crowded room with unusual warmth in her eyes. "Success is often measured by numbers," she began. "Revenue, growth, market share. But several weeks ago, I met someone who reminded me that character cannot be measured on a financial statement." The room grew unexpectedly quiet. I found a family who welcomed a stranger before asking for a name. They offered dignity before questions. They demonstrated that leadership begins long before titles ever do. Daniel watched from the side of the stage, realizing she had abandoned the carefully prepared speech approved by the communications department. Claire continued anyway. "The new Whitmore Community Partnership will invest in people who quietly improve the lives of others every single day. Not because they are famous, because they are faithful." By the following afternoon, news stations across the country repeated excerpts from her remarks. Journalists searched for the unnamed family that had inspired one of the nation's most respected chief executive officers. Yet Claire never revealed Ethan's identity. She understood that true kindness should never become a spectacle without permission. Back in Ashford, life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Ethan repaired engines. Lily attended school. Evenings were still filled with homemade dinners, homework at the kitchen table, and peaceful conversations beside the fireplace. Then, just before sunset on a crisp Friday evening, the familiar sound of tires rolling across the gravel driveway reached Ethan's ears once again. He stepped outside expecting another customer who had broken down before the weekend. Instead, a single dark sedan stopped beside the garage. There were no flashing cameras. No convoy. No security detail waiting in formation. The driver's door opened, and Claire stepped onto the gravel wearing a simple wool coat, blue jeans, and the same gentle smile Lily remembered from the rainy night they first met. Before Ethan could speak, the front door of the farmhouse burst open. Lily raced across the yard as fast as her little legs could carry her. "You came back," she shouted. Claire laughed through joyful tears as she knelt to embrace her. "I promised I hoped I would." Ethan slowly walked toward them, hands still marked with grease from the afternoon's work. "I thought someone as busy as you would forget a little garage in Montana." Claire looked directly into his eyes with complete sincerity. "I remembered it every single day, because sometimes the smallest places leave the biggest space in your heart." The golden light of late autumn stretched across the Carter farmhouse, as though the entire valley had paused to witness something quietly extraordinary. The evening air carried the comforting scent of burning firewood, fresh coffee, and fallen leaves drifting across the gravel driveway. Ethan closed the garage a little earlier than usual, brushing the dust from his hands while Claire stood nearby, watching the familiar routine. She had missed more than she ever expected. Nothing about the place had changed, yet everything felt different because now there were no hidden names and no unanswered questions standing between them. Lily reached for both of their hands at the same time as they walked toward the farmhouse. "Now dinner feels right again," she said with complete confidence. Ethan smiled at the little girl before looking toward Claire. "She has been setting 3 plates every night since you left." Claire stopped walking for just a moment. Her eyes filled with quiet emotion as she looked at the child beside her. "I never stopped wishing I could come back." They shared a simple meal together around the same old kitchen table. Homemade beef stew simmered in heavy bowls. Fresh bread rested inside a woven basket. Soft laughter replaced the silence that had once belonged to strangers. Claire realized that no private chef, no luxury dining room, and no exclusive restaurant had ever given her the peace she felt inside this modest farmhouse. After dinner, she reached into her leather bag and carefully placed a single envelope on the table. Ethan looked at it, but made no move to open it. "What is this?" he asked. Claire answered with her familiar calm voice. "It is not a check." Ethan smiled. "I am glad." She nodded. "Because I knew you would never accept one simply because you helped me." Ethan leaned back quietly. "You are right." Claire gently slid the envelope closer. Inside is an invitation to serve on the advisory board of the Whitmore Community Partnership. "I want someone who understands people more than profits. Someone who knows that dignity cannot be bought and that small towns deserve the same respect as large cities." The position allows you to remain here with Lily. The meetings are only once each month, and the foundation will support rural families all across America. Ethan slowly opened the envelope and read the invitation in silence. There were no promises of luxury, no necessity de words, only an opportunity to continue doing what he had already been doing all his life, helping people with honesty and quiet compassion. He looked up at Claire. "You trust me with something this important?" Claire smiled warmly. "I trusted you long before you knew who I was." The room became peacefully still. Outside, the wind rustled through the maple tree while the last rays of sunlight painted the old garage in shades of amber and gold. Lily looked from one adult to the other with the thoughtful expression children sometimes were when they understand more than anyone realizes. "Can I ask something?" she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Of course." Lily looked directly at Claire. "When you leave this time, how long until you come back?" Claire knelt beside her chair and gently held Lily's small hands. "I was hoping you would ask a different question." Lily tilted her head. "Which one?" Claire glanced toward Ethan before answering with complete sincerity. "I hoped you would ask whether I had to leave at all." Ethan met her eyes, surprised but calm. There was no dramatic speech waiting to be delivered. No grand declaration. Only quiet honesty filling the little farmhouse. Claire took a slow breath. "For years I believed success meant building the largest company I possibly could. Then I spent a few days here and realized I had built everything except a place where I truly belonged." She turned toward Ethan. "I'm not asking you to leave Montana. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm only asking whether you would allow Lily and me to build a future together, one ordinary day at a time." Ethan remained silent for several moments, not because he doubted her, but because some answers deserve the respect of careful thought. Finally, he smiled with the same quiet kindness that had opened his front door on a rainy night weeks earlier. "The first time you came here, you asked me to pretend I had never seen you. I cannot do that anymore." Claire laughed softly through grateful tears. Ethan reached for her hand. "Because now, I cannot imagine this home without you in it." Lily threw her arms around both of them, laughing so brightly that even the old farmhouse seemed warmer. Outside, the last light of day settled gently across the little garage where everything had begun. There were still engines to repair, homework to finish, dinners to cook, and ordinary mornings waiting to arrive. But sometimes the greatest miracles never announce themselves. With applause. Sometimes they begin with a stranger knocking on a weathered front door, a father choosing kindness instead of suspicion, and a little girl offering her favorite blanket without asking for anything in return. In the end, wealth did not transform Ethan's life, and power did not change Claire's heart. Quiet dignity did. Grace did. And as the porch light glowed against the cool Montana evening, while three gentle silhouettes disappeared into the warmth of the farmhouse together. The world remained wonderfully silent, because the greatest victories are not the ones that make the loudest noise, but the ones that finally bring a family home.